Hey, how's it going, guys? Jeremy Morgan here with Abbey Realty. Just want to touch base with you real quick and kind of give you an update on what's going on with the real estate market. One of the main topics that is in the headlines right now is going to be the eviction moratorium is set to expire on the federal level June 30th, so right around the corner here. With that, just want to kind of give you a few correlations that you're going to be seeing, as well as just the headlines and kind of doom and gloom, as it were, that's going to be propagated by the media. They're going to be throwing out a bunch of numbers. It's going to be looking pretty scary. But the entire purpose of this video is just to kind of give context so that you know what it is that they're talking about and be able to take a breath, step back, and realize that, there's some other aspects of the market at play here. And whenever you actually look at it from a different perspective, it's really not as bad as what it's probably going to be portrayed as. So just want to kind of throw that out there and excuse me, compare and contrast some of those correlations that we're seeing from today's market to the previous housing crash of 2006, 7, 8, and that range there. So one of those is you're going to start seeing the eviction starting taking place over the next month or two. It does take a little bit of a process. You do have to go through the proper channels to actually have somebody evicted. It's not just going to happen overnight. But you are going to start seeing in the headlines for the media numbers coming across of 50%, 100%, 3, 4, 5 times the number of foreclosures and evictions of what it was this time last year. And your first thought's going to be, oh crap, and justifiably so. The world's ending, but just press pause on that reaction and take a minute to put the headlines in perspective. So for simplicity, let's just say that we had 10 foreclosures last year and we only had 5 this year. Well, that's a 50% reduction year to year. Now let's say you have 10 foreclosures next year. Well, that's a 100% increase year to year. However, if you take last year's foreclosures and compare them to next year's foreclosures, it's a 0% change. Pulling out this year. So it's all the perspective that you're looking at it. And that's the fun with numbers and statistics. You just have to take a step back and put it into context. So what exactly is that context? Well, according to an article from PR Newswire with citations from Ada Data Solutions and RealtyTrek, there are just under 215,000 properties in 2020 with foreclosure filings, which is a lot. Or is it? Again, you got to put it in perspective. Those 215,000 properties represents 0.16% of all U.S. households. So the foreclosure filings were down approximately 57% from 2019, which came in at 493,000. So that represented 0.36% of U.S. households. Now the moratorium had a significant impact on that reduction, but it was a temporary measure imposed by the government, with the intention to help eliminate people from a possible spike in foreclosures by, people not being able to pay their mortgages or rents for that matter, because they were locked in at home with this pandemic. So they were trying to hedge their bets of, seeing a housing crash like we had in 07, 08, 09, and kind of curtailing that on the front end. Now, again, the theme of this video is context. So we're going to be comparing and contrasting the previous crash with kind of what we're seeing in the market right now and some of those same indicators and correlations. Now, from this graph, you can see that we've had a healthy decline in the number of foreclosure filings since the crash 10 years ago. But we should be expecting to see that spike up a little bit here over the next year or so. The question is, what kind of spike in the foreclosures are we in for? So are we going to have skyrocketing into the 2% range where we had 2 million homes going through foreclosure proceedings like we did 10 years ago? I'm going to go out on a limb and say no, but for a number of reasons. Now, will the headlines come out and say that we've tripled or quadrupled the foreclosure rate over the past year? Yes, absolutely. But why is that? It's because we had a government-imposed moratorium to where those foreclosures were not allowed to take place. So again, the graph shows that we had 214,000 foreclosure proceedings last year. Let's hypothetically say it quadruples in 2021 to 860,000. That's still less than the total foreclosures that we had in all of 2016, as well as 2007 before this infamous housing market crash that we had. Now, it might get bad, unfortunately, for a number of people, but the scale is not going to be what we saw in '08. First off was the fact that the market crash for 2008 through the 10 was a speculative bubble. And around that time, and this time around, it's a mandatory government shutdown. So some of the events that led to the crash were subprime lending mortgages. This is basically where the banks were giving loans to people who otherwise should not have been able to afford a mortgage for a new house. Lenders have a pretty well-established set of standards on how they issue mortgages. And this is based on the person's ability to pay, past credit history, all kinds of different other aspects to avoid them defaulting on the loan. If that default happens, the bank repossesses the house as collateral. And banks are in the business of lending loans, generating interest over the life of that loan. They're not in the business of owning real estate because it ties up their resources to be able to give said loans. Now, in 2008, 2010, Fannie and Freddie Mac were acting as basically quasi-governmental entities and were buying hundreds of billions of dollars worth of subprime loans from lenders in the early 2000s. And you might, obviously foresee this as being a problem. In retrospect, it was. At one point in 2008, Fannie and Freddie accounted for the ownership of nearly 40% of all U.S. mortgages, totaling $1.4 trillion, according to the balance. Now, the purpose of these two entities buying the mortgages in the secondary market was, again, to free up money for banks to lend more loans. Now, if the government is buying those loans, then banks are going to be a little bit looser with the qualifications of obtaining a loan because all they're going to do is just sell it straight to the government. It's like playing hot potato. You give a less desirable loan and you just get rid of it as quickly as possible, and the government is right there to take a hold of it. Well, at one point, you're just loading up on bad debt, and that's exactly what happened. So of that $1.4 trillion, a little more than 8% of it, or $168 billion, was subprime loans. And oddly enough, those subprime loans started to default, which caused a snowball effect. So this graph shows that lower credit score buyers were taking out loans and highlighting the amount of subprime loans in the early 2000s, compared to the crash where it reverts back to this traditionally stronger credit rating for buyers. Next is the low interest rates. Yes, you can probably see that there's a little bit of a correlation between historical crashes and low interest rates. But the type of mortgage also needs to be taken into consideration. Most of y'all know about a conventional mortgage where it's a set interest rate for a set amount of years, typically 15, 20, 30 years. But there's all kinds of mortgages. One of these is an adjustable rate mortgage. This is typically a much shorter duration where the interest rate is set, and then after a certain amount of years, it fluctuates to mimic the actual market rate. So these can be anywhere from 2 to 3 to up to 7 years, and at that point, the interest rate is going to start following the actual market. So you're rolling the dice whenever you take out this kind of a loan, betting that in the future interest rates are going to be either lower than what you have now, or they're at least going to be relatively the same. If they go up, you're pretty much screwed, and you're going to need to be either paying a much higher monthly mortgage, or you're going to have to refinance and hopefully get some money back out to be able to make up the difference. Now, in the early 2000s, the adjustable rate mortgage had as many as 7% of all of these types of mortgages going into foreclosure. Compare that to 1% of conventional loans that went into foreclosure during this economic collapse. Now, that graph was from the Mortgage Bankers Association. Next is the amount of mortgage debt that we currently have on the market. Per Statista, as of December 2020, the total mortgage debt for the U.S. amounted to $10.04 trillion, which is the highest as it's ever been, which means we're obviously over-leveraged, and it's freak out time because it's just crazy, right? Yes and no. Context matters. Again, that's the purpose of this video. Last year, we saw millions, tens of millions of people refinancing their houses because we had historical low interest rates. People were taking advantage of having their existing mortgage refinanced from a 5 or even a 6% interest rate down to sub 3%. Now, because of such a huge drop in the percentage on their interest rates, they were able to pull out equity in their house and still have the same exact payment as well as the payoff date. So that's why you have such an escalated loan to value ratio going up and the perceived mortgage debt on this country. So yes and no, but people had more cash in their pocket. Now, whether or not they were actually spending that cash, sensibly, I can't really speak to that. But now, per the U.S. Census Bureau, out of 183 million homes in the U.S., 39 to 42% of those homes have no mortgage, period. It's completely paid for. That is up nearly 5.5% compared to the prior years of the market crash between 2007 and 2009, where it was in the low 30s. Now, this mindset is just a more conservative action for most people owning their houses. So that's one of the major differences between today and prior years. Okay, so what about everybody else? Well, another 10 to 15% of households have more than 50% equity in their home. So more than half the country has either all of their home paid for or at least half of the home paid for at this point. It's a conservative mentality whenever they're thinking about finances for their home. Now, this mentality has been the same for most other people having mortgages in the U.S., where approximately 6 to 7% have more equity today at approximately 21% ownership in their home compared to the 2008 crash, where it topped out at only 14%. Okay, so you're looking at this graph and maybe you're thinking, all right, there's a correlation between high equity and a forthcoming downturn. Obviously, you're looking at the years running up before 2008 and you're looking at it where it's at right now. Both of those trends are going upwards. Well, again, context matters, and we have a different situation today than we had in 2008. Per the Mortgage Bankers Association and Barron's data, as of February 16th this year, approximately 5.3% of mortgages are currently in forbearance, which amounts to approximately $523 billion of that $10 trillion that we just talked about, which is a significant number. Now, once this moratorium is raised, are we going to see all of that 5% of mortgages go into forbearance actually go into foreclosures? Well, maybe, but probably not. 28% of those forbearances represent borrowers that have continued to make their monthly payments during the forbearance period. Basically what they did is they just went to their bank and kind of got in line saying, hey, we think we might have an issue if either I or my wife gets laid off. We want to go ahead and get this thing set up to where we can start working with you. But during that time, they've continued to make their monthly mortgage payment as scheduled normal. 25% of these forbearances resulted in a loan or deferral of partial claim. This is where you can resume your regular payments, but you can't afford to increase your payment. So you might have missed, the first payment whenever the pandemic started, but you were able to get your feet back under you pretty quickly and you resumed your regular payments. What this did is they just added a payment on the back side of your loan, or they're just going to put a lien on the house so that whenever you sell it, they'll get that money back for that 1 month that you missed. 15% resulted in reinstatements, which is where you had past due amounts are paid back whenever they just exited the forbearance program. Approximately 14% represented borrowers who did not make all their payments and they actually exited the forbearance without a loss mitigation plan in place. So they're just kind of venturing back out, trying to make do with what they had. So what we're seeing is more than half of the actual loans in forbearance really aren't in that much of a dire strait. The number 2 difference between today and 2008 is the supply and demand of economics. We currently have a very limited amount of selection for buyers at the moment, and per HAR, Houston currently has a 1.6 month inventory supply versus the 3.3 month inventory supply prior to the pandemic. Now, what does that mean and what is in monthly inventory? The home inventory is the total number of current listings divided by the number of total homes sold the prior month. This basically tells you how long it would take to sell every single house currently on the market without adding a new house on the market. This is a stark difference compared to the years running up to the housing crash when in 2005 and 2006, there were around 3 to 4 months of supply on the market. As the standards for loans kept getting lower, more and more homes were built to take advantage of the expected sales to a point where in 2007, there were almost 8 months worth of inventory on the market. because the entire market was just based on speculation. Today, people are receiving multiple offers on the first day because it's not speculation, it's pure demand. And that's the difference between we're having so many homes available where it would take 8 months to sell every house listed on the market versus 1.6 months that we have today. Now, there's still another number of factors at play, but the answer is yes. We're going to feel a hit from a market correction, possibly even a crash here in the near future. Now, it could be the end of the month, it could be 2 years from now. Nobody can really predict it, but there's enough data out there to reasonably forecast the severity of this. Will this one result in a 2 or 4 or even 800% increase in foreclosures? Yeah. I mean, it's pure numbers. Going from 0 to 1 is a 100% increase. So whenever the federal government artificially drives the number to 0 for all intents and purposes because of the moratorium that was enacted, any increase back to normal is going to appear to be exorbitant. But again, context matters. So remember, if we quadruple the number of foreclosures that we have this year, which was at 214,000 for 2020, it's still going to be lower than the number that we had in 2016. And the fact that we just went through a global pandemic and a complete economic shutdown of our country, all things considered, it's really not going to be that bad. Now, that's not to say that the correction could be worse, but just take a breath whenever you start seeing the media's headlines of doom and gloom and take it with a grain of salt. Step back and look at the actual relationship of what's going on. With that, guys, just want to wrap up and say thank you for tuning in. I enjoy doing these videos, and it's pretty informational for my side. Just kind of diving into the research on it. Hopefully, you gained a little bit of knowledge out of it and kind of put some things in perspective and gave you some context of what's going on. So, if you got any kind of questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you about this kind of stuff. Again, my number is going to be 281-727-0946. Email me at jmorgantxra@gmail.com. Check out the website, jmorgantxra.com. Instagram, jmorgantxra. Facebook, jmorgan, Houston Realtor, I believe. So, there's a number of different ways to reach out. I'd love to have some conversations with you, answer some questions, or even cover some different topics. If there's something else you would like to talk about, or kind of me doing some research and give you some information on, I'd love to do that as well. So with that, appreciate it, and see you guys next time. Thanks.